Damascus, January 2000. A one-eyed old man with a crippled left hand languishes in the jails of Bashar al-Assad. This man, imprisoned in utmost secrecy, is Alois Brunner. Condemned to death in absentia in 1954 in France. Brunner was a former Nazi official responsible for the deportation of more than 130,000 European Jews to the gas chambers. In 1943, Alois Brunner, an SS officer, arrived in the camp of Drancy on the outskirts of Paris. Drancy was the last transit camp for French Jews before they were sent off to the death camps.
Brunner's mission was simple, to revive the final solution. In Drancy, it was to be the reign of terror.
For Alois Brunner and his staff, the hunting down of all the Jews in France became a total obsession.
They were a group of totally sick, hysterical anti-Semites, insane.
In Drancy, prisoners were submitted to torture, humiliation and abuse on a daily basis. What's extraordinary with Brunner is his obstinacy went even beyond that of his superiors. In order to send even more convoys to the death camps, Brunner was pitiless. Men, women, the old and even children were all destined for deportation. There was a knock at the door. Open up, it's the police. You've got 5 minutes to get ready. No more than 5 kilos of luggage per person. For the first time, historians, investigators, as well as those who had merely come across him or even hunted him down, men like Serge Klarsfeld, tell the terrifying story of the butcher of Drancy.
One thing I clearly remember is his voice, that monochord voice that was so frightening, and the way he stared.
Our story begins on the morning of March the 12th, 1938, when the Wehrmacht 8th Army Corps crossed the Austro-German border and invaded Austria. Hitler's dream of a Reich uniting all the German-speaking lands had finally been accomplished. The Nazification of Austria took place with no resistance whatsoever. German tanks entered Austria in 1938, with nothing to slow them down but the cheering crowds. This pro-Nazi fervor was 100% Austrian. One man, long dedicated to the Nazi ideal, was at the forefront of the population in acclaiming the invasion of German troops. That man was Alois Brunner. Brunner was the son of a peasant from a village in a region called Burgenland. It was a region of castles and a very special sort of place. On the border between Austria and Hungary, the region had long aspired to being German. Brunner had been a rather brilliant child, one of the few peasant children in his village to attend secondary school. He showed his enthusiasm for the Nazi Party very early on. And because of his personal qualities, the party sent him to Germany, to what was known as the Austrian Legion. The Austrian Legion was comprised of 4,000 hand-picked Austrian members of the Nazi Party. He became part of the SD, security guards to the SS. They were the true elite of the SS as far as repression was concerned. In Vienna, Brunner came into contact with a man called Adolf Eichmann, who was director of the Central Office for Jewish Emigration. Brunner managed to convince Eichmann to take him on as assistant director. Hitler and the Gestapo command decided to begin by cleaning up Vienna as soon as the Nazis arrived there in 1938. Brunner was to demonstrate his qualities as an outstanding organizer. And this was coupled with a total and irrepressible hatred of Jews, as well as a taste for violence so typical of the SS.
des SS.
Everything was done to ruin the lives of the Jews and to force them to leave the country, so there was social violence as well as physical violence.
It was a policy of expulsion on an industrialized scale. Eichmann called it assembly line work. You put a Jew on the end of the line, you took absolutely everything from him, and he ended up with a passport and an ultimatum to leave the country within 15 days. Before the end of the war, Eichmann and Brunner had forced more than 100,000 Austrian Jews to emigrate. Between 1940 and 41, Brunner deported them to camps. June 1940. It was France's turn to fall under the Nazi jackboot. Marshal Pétain was given full powers and he formed a collaboration government.
The Vichy regime, led by Pétain, thought that Nazi Germany was going to win the war, and that the best thing for France was to stay on the winning side on a permanent basis and to get along with them. Marshal Pétain believed that the first ground for such an entente might be political anti-Semitism.
At the end of September 1940, I think it was September the 27th, Jews became obliged to declare themselves to their neighborhood police station. So people were immediately on police records. A large red 1 centimeter stamp saying Jew was stamped on their identity cards.
Among the first measures taken, and also the most spectacular, was the enactment of a law on the status of the Jews. This excluded Jews from public functions and from any occupation in the cultural domain.
Suddenly, Jews no longer had the right to work. They no longer had the right to carry out their professions. As students, they couldn't continue beyond a secondary school diploma, except for numerus clausus. Take my parents, they sold shoes and stockings in an open-air market, and they were forced to put a sign on their stall marked Jewish business. Progressively, anti-Semitism was to invade France. On August the 20th, 1941, a massive raid took place in Paris. Very early in the morning, neighborhoods with large Jewish populations were surrounded. And some 4,500 people were taken prisoner.
Thousands of Jews were sent to Drancy. They were the first Jews to be interned in the camp. The layout in Drancy was simple. The central building was U-shaped. Once the entrance was blocked, the enclosed area could be turned into a prison camp.
An integral part of a housing estate, the Drancy camp was composed of 3 adjacent buildings encircled by barbed wire. French police posted on guard inside and outside the camp were in charge of watching over the prisoners.
Drancy had the advantage of being located 15 kilometers east of Paris and was not far away from the railway hub. But more importantly, it could hold a great number of people. In fact, they opened a camp and crammed people into it, and nothing was done to accommodate them. There was no running water. Obviously, housing conditions were atrocious. There were no blankets, no mattresses. Provisions were almost non-existent, being managed by the police prefecture.
It was disorganization French style. Living conditions very soon became horrible, atrocious. A few months after the camp opened, hundreds were already ill. Many suffered from cachexia, from starvation. Some couldn't survive in Drancy. They were dying of hunger. There were about a dozen deaths a day at that time. At the end of 1941, Brunner and his staff in the Reich Central Security Office took the horror one step further.
In 1941, there was a shift into what was known as the final solution, systematic assassination. At the turn of 1941-42, Brunner was sent to Berlin and put in charge of deportations from the Reich capital.
He had a fanatical determination. He had to fill the trains. He'd be sent elsewhere if there were no trains, or if it were no longer possible to deport Jews. So he was fulfilling a mission. And although he was really only a middle-ranking policeman, he was all-powerful. He was given a mission, a criminal mission, and one of huge scope. I'm going to show these damned Prussians how we treat these Jewish pigs. This is how Brunner spoke when he arrived in Berlin, with the order to increase deportations, which in the eyes of the Führer were too slow. 3 months later, 20,000 Berlin Jews had been deported. Throughout Europe, Jews over the age of 6 were henceforth forced to wear a yellow star. In France, this practice openly displayed the persecution of the Vichy regime, and the French population could no longer pretend to ignore it. Francine Christophe was 9 years old when she was given the order to wear a yellow star.
Mama went to the prefecture. She had to queue to get the stars, and she had to pay for them. And more importantly, she had to pay with some of our precious textile coupons, so much less for clothing. Mama and I left with our stars. There used to be greengrocers then. They no longer exist now. And Mama knew them very well. She bought vegetables from them. When they saw her badge, they stared at her and said, "But, Madame Christophe, are you Jewish? Is that what Jews are like?" And that's always remained with me. Is that what Jews are like? Yes, not different from others.
In June 1942, Eichmann decided to strike a blow in Paris, to deport 50,000 Jews. On June the 30th, he came to Paris in person and spent 2 days in the capital organizing things. His plan was for a massive raid on the 16th of July, right after the 14th of July, the French National Day. The raid, organized by Eichmann, Brunner's superior, went down in history under the sad name of the Veldiv Roundup. The French police and gendarmes obviously collaborated. Nothing could be done without their help. Thousands of policemen had been called in for this job. A list of Jews in Paris had been drawn up by the police. They simply went to people's homes. They had names, they had addresses, they arrived and knocked. There was a knock at the door. "Open up, it's the police. You've got 5 minutes to get ready. No more than 5 kilos of luggage per person." My mother spoke up. "My children are French." And the policeman said he didn't give a damn and to get a move on. Maurice Rajfus was 14 when he was arrested. There were buses in Paris neighborhoods that followed the police on their round and that took people either to Drancy, if there were no children, or if there were children, to the velodrome, the Veldiv. Maurice Rajfus and his sister were miraculously released. Their parents were not.
On the 16th and 17th of July 1942, slightly more than 13,000 Jews were arrested. And it was the first time that men, women and children had been arrested in broad daylight.
Drancy suddenly filled up. The first real deportation convoys could now be organized and sent to Auschwitz. My parents arrived in Drancy on the night of the 16th of July, 42, and were deported on the 27th of July, 10 days later. During the winter of 1942-43, the deportation convoys towards the death camps increased throughout Europe. At this time, Brunner was sent to Greece with the orders to clear the Thessalonica ghetto of its inhabitants. Almost all the Jews in Greece lived in Thessalonica. They were confined to a district of barely 3 hectares. containing about 600 apartments to be used for housing them. But this turned out to be 3 months. And within this time, the 50,000 Jews of Thessalonica were almost all deported. There were convoys made up of 2,000 to 3,000 people. And the journey from Thessalonica lasted 7 to 10 days. And by the time the Greek Jews arrived in Auschwitz, many had already caught typhus. In the meantime, deportations in France had decreased considerably. Some of the voices hostile to the anti-Semitic policy of the Vichy regime had begun to be heard.
The public was against Vichy collaborating in deportations. The raids, anyone who witnessed the raids, the internment or the deportation, all this caused a real fracture in public opinion. As Laval said, I can give no more. Be careful, we have to slow down. What I promised I can no longer carry out. We'll do as much as possible, but I can't.
In the spring of 1943, no convoys left from Drancy, and this greatly displeased the German authorities.
In May 1943, Eichmann made a decision that was crucial. He sent the man who he considered the best, Alois Brunner. And his mission was simple, to launch the final solution. And this professional in anti-Semite persecution and deportation for extermination took command of the Drancy transit camp. Apart from a few convoys, all the Jews captured in France were transferred to Drancy before being sent on to the extermination camps, particularly Auschwitz-Birkenau.
As soon as he arrived in Drancy, Brunner completely reorganized the camp. From the very start, Alois Brunner didn't want the French police involved. He considered them incompetent. So he banned them from the inside of the camp. Gendarmes were to have the job of guarding the outside and of preventing escapes, and that was all.
He took over Drancy camp and transformed it into something else, based on German concentration camps.
Brunner was a cunning man. He was a clever policeman. He understood that at Drancy there weren't many policemen. So he had to create a system where the prisoners themselves kept order. The inmates chosen were mainly Alsatians, and for a simple reason. They spoke German and could serve as intermediaries between the SS and the prisoners. There were about 60 Alsatians who were given clerical jobs in the camp without ever having requested it. It was a terrible trap. If you didn't accept the job, someone else would. So, should you leave others in appalling conditions to avoid retaliatory measures? Because Brunner was a savage with a staff of savages. Brunner hadn't come to Paris alone. He was accompanied by a handful of Nazis who, like him, were driven by an overpowering hatred of Jews.
Brunner arrived accompanied by a group of Austrian Nazis who had been with him since the beginning of his career. They were extremely violent men. Terror reigned in Drancy. Brunner himself was one of the most violent of them. He was known for his fits of temper and brutality.
It was a regime of fear. You had to go to the toilet on time or not at all. You couldn't leave your room and you'd no right to.
There was a real implementation of strict military discipline. The inmates had to stand to attention when they met a member of the SS. And the prisoners suffered harsh violence, but strangely enough, an amelioration in their conditions. We do work inside the camp, redo the camp courtyard or paint the staircase.
And he obliged us to clean up the rooms, so that the people would feel better.
Brunner had an obsession. He needed it to work. He wanted a sort of rationalization. It had never worked before, so you might say that we had a, quote-unquote, improvement in camp living conditions. Certain services were organized, obviously, by the inmates themselves. A dental service, a canteen. There were quite a few different services organized, but always with the same objective in view: deportation for extermination. All this helped deport Jews in calm conditions, but most of all, it prevented them from thinking the worst.
In the 1950s, Drancy was rehabilitated. Today it appears to be an ordinary suburban town, but it is heavily marked by its past. Arrested with her mother, Francine Christophe arrived here shortly after Brunner took charge.
So I came this way towards Brunner's office. It was called the Kommandantur. It's where everything happened. Everything. When we got close, we were frightened. Mama and I didn't stay long in Brunner's office, just long enough to show him our papers, proving that we were mother and daughter of a war prisoner. Then we left. He didn't have time to waste on us, you understand? He had other things to do. There were 200 women and 80 children waiting to see him. But I do remember that according to her papers, one of the women waiting had 4 children, but had only brought 3. And as he was a very mild-tempered man, he slapped her hard until she almost fainted, trying to get her to admit where she had hidden the 4th child. She said nothing. She was sent off to Germany with the elder children, and the 4th remained hidden. I shall never forget his voice, that monochord voice that was so frightening, and the way he stared. Mama and I spoke of it later. Mama said it's terrible. When I hear that voice and I see that stare, I'm immediately frightened. And even though he wasn't necessarily speaking to me, I'm scared.
But it wasn't enough for Brunner to frighten people. He and his men tortured them.
This is the door that went down to the cellars. The cellars were the prisons. Horrible things happened in those cells. People were tortured. There was one particular practice at Drancy. People were put in there, naked, and left to freeze. The other trick was breaking people's forearms. We're at both the entrance and the exit of Drancy here. The barrier is there. And this is what are known as the 2 departure stairs, or departure blocks. The first 2 here and there is where people were brought before leaving for Auschwitz. That there was enclosed by barbed wire. No one had the right to cross it. Those who were there didn't have the right to leave, and those in the camp didn't have the right to enter. Except a few women, like my mother, the assistants of the departure stairs, that was their name, and they tried to alleviate the terrible suffering of these people.
Departure took place in the early morning under the surveillance of French gendarmes.
They accompanied us as far as the bus. There were terrible scenes. People got into the bus, old people half broken. Well, you had to get into the buses. I remember Mama coming back in the evenings when there'd been large departures. Mama came into our room and fell onto the bed, sobbing.
Under Brunner's direction, deportation became a rational, bureaucratic, and inflexible organization.
There was an entire internal categorization of people using letters, A, B, C, D, E, F, etc. B meant deportable. The other letters corresponded to people with Aryan spouses, people waiting to be verified as Aryan, citizens from neutral or allied countries, etc., etc., etc.
In general, the deportables stayed only a few days in Drancy, about a week. But the goal was to send them immediately to Auschwitz. It was very well organized. There were convoys of 6,000 people, so they were split into groups. 220 groups of 50. 50 people filled a bus, and 20 buses made up a convoy of 1,000 people. Brunner sent a total of more than 20 convoys, mainly from the WWII train station, located 3 kilometers from Drancy. It was a final voyage into the unknown for 23,885 Jews. During the years of internment, most of the inmates didn't know the final destination of their journey east. They'd say that they were leaving for Pichipoy. Pichipoy is a symbolic name for nowhere, an imaginary name for a god-forsaken place. It's something like that in Yiddish. It might translate as some god-forsaken hole.
No one knows Pichipoy. It is the unknown. It's a place about which we know nothing. It's surrounded by mystery. It's neither good nor bad. It's Pichipoy. No one knows.
But Brunner's system was beginning to falter. They were told that they were going to work. You'll work in the fields, you'll work in the factories, in the east. But they saw invalids arriving, old people, some 99 years old. They saw babies with tags on their feet, labeled terrorist. And then a lot of people began to doubt the truth of the working in the East story. And the proof is that there were a lot of suicides in Drancy at this time. People didn't want to get into the trains. You might suppose, and many believed, that their real destination was death. The wagons were loaded at the WWII station. There were about 80 to 100 people per wagon. No one could sit down. Everyone had to stand. It was horrific. And the trip took 2 to 3 days, without water or food.
It was more than 1,000 kilometers, but it was very quickly covered by train. At its peak, deportation from France was very, very quick, really very, very quick. It took more time to send a letter in those days than to deport a Jew.
When they arrived in Auschwitz, they got out of the wagons. The children were gassed immediately. To escape the gas chamber, you had to be at least 16 and have a strong enough constitution for Mengele to decide to put you with the workers.
But
most of the deportees went straight to the gas chambers. Towards the end of summer 1943, Brunner turned his attention to the Italian-occupied zone in southeastern France. Fleeing Nazi exactions, 50,000 Jews had found refuge in this region between Nice and Grenoble.
The Italians refused to deliver Jews to Vichy, but why? We have a fascist Italian regime that refused. The military authorities, in this case, refused to deliver the Jews from within their zone of occupation, extending from Nice to Grenoble. For Brunner, this was an abscess that had to be drained. He planned a massive occupation that would sweep up right through the Italian zone. He wasn't quite sure how to implement it, but in September 1943, the WWII proclamation was announced. Italy quit Germany and joined the Allies.
During the night of 8-9 September 1943, the Italians abandoned the region. Brunner arrived in Nice on the Marseille train on 10th of September at precisely 10:30 a.m. By 3 or 3:30 in the afternoon, he had already cordoned off an area of hotels and arrested several dozen Jews.
The objective was 25,000 arrests. Starting in September 1943, he initiated the most violent and widespread chapter of what is known as the Jew Hunt of France.
Such massive raids had never been seen before, not in Western Europe. They were more like those that happened in Eastern Europe.
Roadblocks were set up in the city centre. Hotels were controlled because Jews, as refugees, were living in hotels, hostels and boarding houses. So these were targeted. Restaurants and bars were also targeted. Jews were increasingly barred from practicing a trade. They had nothing to do and tried to find respite in places of relaxation.
The next step was to target hospitals, clinics, rest homes and children's homes. And then raids on whole neighborhoods were finally carried out. In one raid, the fate of the Klaasfeld family dramatically changed. I had just turned 8 on the 17th of September 1943. My father told us that if we were arrested, he would survive because he was strong. We wouldn't survive because there was nothing to eat in a camp. There were epidemics, etc., etc. And he built a very deep false bottom in a closet. He said that if the Germans come here, my mother and my sister and I were to get in it. It was the 30th of September, 3 weeks after the arrival of the Germans. And suddenly, we saw lights illuminating the ceiling. We heard trucks arrive. And we got into the hiding place. And at the same moment, they rang. My father opened the door, and they immediately asked, I heard them, "Where are your wife and children?" And my father said, "The place has been disinfected and they've gone to the country." But they started searching the apartment anyway. We heard the closet door opening. A German pushed the clothes aside along the rail to see if there was anyone behind them. His hand was only a few centimeters from the partition, which he didn't touch. So he never realized that it was wood and not a wall. He closed the closet door. The Germans told my father to get dressed and to follow them. And my father found himself alone in the apartment, and he stepped into the closet. My mother opened the door, and he kissed my mother's hand, then he left. Transferred to Drancy and sent to Auschwitz, Arno Klaasfeld died 9 months later. In Nice, the ordeal for the arrested Jews began at the Excelsior Hotel, where Brunner had his headquarters.
Brunner's personality as a man of action is evident here. He wasn't content to merely send his troops to proceed with the arrests. He went in person. He made his headquarters in the Hotel Excelsior, well known on the Côte d'Azur. It was an annex of Drancy. Some rooms were transformed into detention cells. The SS were given the best rooms.
He installed an infirmary and a small torture center. The system consisted of beating people to get addresses from them. And then they were treated in the infirmary, so that they were well enough to be tortured again. The interrogators wanted to know where friends and family could be found.
And every time they found out the address of a Jew or his family, they arrested them. Sometimes they went dozens or hundreds of kilometers to arrest them.
Between Nice and Grenoble, Brunner used every means possible to arrest the largest number of Jews.
He used all sorts of methods, highly developed police methods, including tailing. A Jew or a Jewess was identified in the street and then followed home. Once home, the authorities then came to the door and arrested the entire family. Brunner also used physiognomists. These were white Russians based in France who pretended that they could recognize Jews by their features.
If a person appeared to be Jewish, then their identity papers were controlled and then were undressed to verify if they were circumcised or not.
Brunner's premise was very simple. Everyone was Jewish until proven otherwise. If you were arrested, you were Jewish, and then you had to prove that you weren't.
It was planned to use informers who would be paid 100 francs per head. But this quickly rose to 1,000 francs because the number of informers was insufficient. And it would cost a lot in order to arrest 25,000 people. In 3 months, Brunner and his men caught 2,500 people. This was far less than the 25,000 that they had hoped for. I'm certain that Brunner was very disappointed. Despite all the means at his disposal, he had not even been able to deport 10% of the targeted population. In November 1943, an event at Drancy forced Brunner to urgently return there from the south of France. An escape attempt had just been foiled. The planned tunnel escape had probably been disclosed through the foolishness of a prisoner who had been transferred from Drancy to Compiègne and who told his fellow prisoners, "I'm really unlucky. I was only 2 days away from escaping from Drancy."
And the tunnel was discovered when there was less than 2 meters to dig before reaching a safe point to escape from.
The group which had dug the tunnel was also responsible for the management of the camp. Their punishment was merciless. Immediate deportation. With Brunner, this was automatic. If you did anything that did not please him, then you were on the next convoy out. Towards the end of 1943, Brunner began a sordid series of arrests. The number of convoys sent to the death camps needed to increase every month. In order to satisfy his obsession, he spared no one.
Brunner even deported us, because Jews were deported. That was the regulation. Except that we were protected by the Geneva Convention. Families of war prisoners could not be killed. So we were sent to Bergen-Belsen. We were 200 women and 80 children who could prove that we were wives of prisoners of war. Because sadly, the women who couldn't prove that they were wives of prisoners of war were deported to Auschwitz.
In order to send more convoys, Brunner then turned towards the UGIF, a French Jewish organization in charge of managing several hospitals and orphanages.
Alois Brunner fell upon easy prey. He didn't hesitate to launch operations against the UGIF children's homes, where he knew the children were living. In the summer of 1944, this led to roundups. There's no other word for it. All the children who were confined to these orphanages, children whose parents had already been deported. These were very young children. Some of them weren't even 1 or 2 years old. They were taken to Drancy and placed on the last convoys, particularly Convoy 76 and Convoy 77 that left for Auschwitz in the summer of 1944.
August 1944. The Allied advance on Paris might have put an end to Brunner's macabre acts. But once again, whereas the Reich was collapsing on all fronts, Brunner demonstrated a dogged tenacity.
On the 17th of August 1944, when Brunner left the camp, there were about 1,300 Jews still interned there, and it greatly angered Brunner to leave these Jews behind him. He used every means possible to find trains. It was a problem of logistics. Trains had to be found.
Brunner wanted to requisition a train that was reserved for German soldiers, some of whom were wounded. A Wehrmacht colonel denied Brunner's request. He no longer had any authority. He was finished. But by haggling with certain officers of the Wehrmacht, Brunner managed to find a solution. He obtained a wagon from an artillery unit in exchange for food. That consisted of a few pigs that he had raised at Drancy.
He chose about 60 prisoners amongst those he hated the most. Most were members of the resistance. It also included Dassault, the aircraft manufacturer. 60 members of the resistance who he loathed and detested, and that he was determined to deport with him at all costs.
On Sunday, August the 20th, 1944, the last interned Jew left the camp in Drancy. But Drancy didn't close, and for the first time, cameras were allowed to film by the new occupants. It became an internment camp for collaborators. It was so well organized for holding thousands of people that the Liberation Army used it for detaining collaborators. Back in Vienna, Brunner was given a new mission. Eichmann sent him to continue his macabre work in Bratislava in Slovakia. What's so extraordinary about Brunner is his tenacity, his determination that even exceeded that of his superiors. Even Himmler had already negotiated with the Allies, but Brunner continued until the end of March 1945.
On 13th of March 1945, another convoy left under his supervision. They were truly a group of deranged, fanatical anti-Semites. They were absolutely obsessed.
C'est leur obsession absolue.
On May the 8th, 1945, Field Marshal Keitel signed the German instrument of surrender. From then on, Brunner, like all Nazi high officials, had only one idea in mind: to vanish into anonymity. After the defeat, Alois Brunner did what most SS members did. He concealed his identity. He threw away his SS uniform and found a uniform of a simple soldier. He assumed the identity of a cousin in order to avoid detection. He was even arrested and detained in an American prison camp, but he was later released. Hiding behind a false identity, Brunner returned to an ordinary civilian life without a worry in the world about his criminal past. It was only when a real hunt for the Nazis began at the end of 1953 that he became worried and left for Damascus. In Damascus, he founded, along with other Nazis, a company called Otraco. It was in fact a highly profitable front for smuggling arms in the Near East. Brunner's lot suddenly changed in 1960, when Eichmann was captured in South America by Israeli Secret Service agents. In order to judge him, the Mossad exfiltrated the former Nazi officer to Jerusalem. Eichmann was kidnapped by the Israelis, and a trial was set. The Austrian police received information that Brunner was planning to kidnap Chaim Goldman. He was the president of the World Jewish Congress, and he was giving a conference in Vienna. Brunner's idea was to exchange Goldman for Eichmann's liberation by the Israelis. In response to this kidnapping plan, Brunner received a mysterious package in Damascus. Yasser Harel, the head of Mossad at the time, practically admitted to me that it was Mossad that had sent the bomb. He told me, "We took care to ensure that this person didn't disrupt Eichmann's trial." Brunner miraculously survived the assassination attempt, but with serious consequences. His face was burned and he lost the sight of his left eye. Eichmann's trial proceeded as planned.
In Jerusalem, Adolf Eichmann was condemned to death for the extermination of 6 million Jews. Once again, and for the last time, he appeared in the glass cage at the Jerusalem courthouse.
Like other Nazi criminals before him, Eichmann was hanged on the 31st of May, 1962. Feeling that he was in danger, Brunner sought protection from General Hafez al-Assad, the new strongman of Syria. Alois Brunner was there to train Hafez al-Assad's inner circle. Brunner had met Hafez al-Assad before he arrived in power, and he participated with him in organizing Syria's system of repression. Brunner's help was totally decisive for the creation of the Mukhabarat. Those are the Syrian secret police who control the country. With dark glasses, a thin moustache and a false name, Brunner, alias Georg Fischer, attempted to live in Damascus as discreetly as possible. But Mossad was watching him. This time, the Israeli Secret Service had definitely decided to finish him off. Alois Brunner had a small weakness that was to cost him dear. He had a subscription to a mail-order service that supplied medicinal herbs. And one day in 1980, he received an awaited package. It was a slightly bulky letter, and it exploded in his hand. As a consequence, he lost the fingers on one hand. In France, the Klaasvelds, who actively fought against the immunity of former Nazi criminals, tackled Brunner's file. I decided to go to Syria. The police stopped me because I didn't have a visa. But I handed over the Brunner file and demanded that they let me enter. Well, it was really to expose the problem, to demonstrate that Brunner was in Syria and that he must be pursued. Serge Klaasveld's work awakened public interest. As a consequence, Brunner's extradition became a public media issue. In 1985, a dramatic turn of events took place when 2 German journalists managed to approach the former Nazi criminal. The German journalists succeeded in passing themselves off as Nazi sympathizers, and thanks to a camera hidden in a watch, they took 3 photos of Brunner. And that hit the front page of Bunte.
Damascus, 7 Haddad Street. This is where Alois Brunner lives and was found by journalists from Bunte. He lives under the name of Georg Fischer. He is now 73 years old.
One of the photos published in Bunte allowed a clear identification of the man who was hiding in Damascus under a false identity. The ears are part of the body that are like fingerprints. Every single person has ears that are unique. There are no duplicates. They had a full-face photo, which they could superimpose on his photo from his SS file. The person in the Drancy photo and the person in the Bunte photo were one and the same. So we were certain that it was Alois Brunner. With Brunner formally identified, the French judiciary did its utmost to obtain his extradition. Things began to go sour when Jacques Chirac made an official visit to Syria. I asked President Chirac if he could ask Hafez al-Assad if Alois Brunner was in Syria. And Assad assured him before God, Alois Brunner, don't know him, never heard of him. Given the dictator's denial, the examining magistrates tried a new strategy with the help of a famous French journalist. I asked him if, during the interview with Hafez al-Assad, he could ask Hafez al-Assad if Brunner was present in Damascus.
It appears that the examining magistrate thinks that he might be or might have been in Damascus. If I myself don't know where he is, then how could the French judge know where he is? It just doesn't make sense.
What was interesting in this investigation was to see the physical reaction of Hafez al-Assad.
You never protected him. Nothing is hidden in this country.
This man is a foreigner. If he were here, I would know it. If you know where he is, then I'll send someone to accompany you to him.
And this reaction led me to believe that although he denied Brunner's presence, he was actually aware of it. This type of pursuit, more or less diplomatic, compelled the Syrian government to conceal Brunner. Because the appearance of Brunner would have revealed a rather large lie on the part of the Syrian authorities. So then his movements were restricted. At first he wasn't allowed to leave. That was the first step. The second step consisted in obscuring the windows. He lived in a completely black room. And with this he became hysterical. He was hidden underground and never came out again. With Bashar al-Assad's accession to power in July 2000, Brunner's situation changed for the worse. The conditions were even more difficult. Brunner was confined in a cell and never left it. The food was revolting. You could hear him crying. According to the testimony of his guard, he was losing his mind. He had lost an eye. He had lost the fingers on one hand. He was going to pieces, bit by bit. He really had a pathetic end. So, in fact, he was punished. He would have been much better in a German or French prison than hidden in a cell at the bottom of a building in Damascus. Alois Brunner, the butcher of Drancy, doubtlessly remained secretly detained in jail by Bashar al-Assad up until 2001. Alois Brunner died in his underground dungeon. After dark, he was buried according to the Muslim rite. And that was the last of Brunner. Just like that, all alone. Justice never caught up with Brunner, except for the inconvenience of a few letter bombs. But for a man who was responsible for the deportation and death of 130,000 people, it was way too small a price to pay. The butcher of Drancy was convicted in absentia in 2001 for his role in the deportation of French Jewish children. Alois Brunner remains one of the principal unpunished Nazi criminals, a stain on our history.